This story belongs to the world of God of War, a universe where myth is not metaphor and belief alone does not grant power. Here, gods are not distant concepts carved into temples or whispered through prayers. They walk the earth, they bleed, they argue, love, betray, and rule not from the sky, but from stone halls, mountain paths, and city streets shaped by mortal hands. In this world, divinity is not perfection, it is authority. Long before the age of vengeance, before names like Kratos carried the weight of broken pantheons, there was a quieter era, an age when gods did not yet fear mortals, and mortals did not yet dream of killing gods. The balance between them was uneasy, but intact. This was the age when gods still walked among mortals. In the earliest known era of this world, the gods were not hidden behind realms or sealed away by cosmic rules. Olympus stood tall, but its influence stretched far beyond its shining peaks. The Olympians ruled openly, not merely as distant overseers, but as present powers woven into daily life. Zeus's thunder did not only split skies in moments of wrath, it marked borders, ended wars, and sanctified oaths. Athena did not merely represent wisdom, she trained warriors, advised kings, and shaped the strategies that determined the survival of entire city-states. The gods were visible because they needed to be. Power in this world did not flow automatically from belief. A god's strength was sustained through authority, worship, and, most importantly, control over order. Without active governance, divinity weakened. This was the unspoken truth of the pantheon. Gods ruled not because they were eternal, but because they maintained structure. When order faltered, so did their power. Mortals understood this instinctively. Cities were built around temples, not out of devotion alone, but necessity. A city protected by Ares would thrive in war, but rot in peace. A city favored by Athena would flourish in strategy and craft, yet suffer when passion overruled reason. Divine favor was not neutral, it shaped culture, values, and fate itself. During this age, gods walked openly because distance bred instability. When mortals felt abandoned, they turned to other forces, ancient titanic remnants, forgotten magic, or forbidden rituals drawn from older epics. The Olympians remembered well what happened when mortals reached beyond them, and so they remained close. But this closeness came at a cost. To walk among mortals was to be seen not as eternal, but as fallible. The gods argued in public. Their rivalry spilled into human wars. When Hera's jealousy flared, entire bloodlines were erased. When Poseidon's pride was wounded, coastlines drowned. Mortals learned that divine presence did not guarantee safety, it guaranteed consequence. Yet for all this danger, there was balance. In this age, divine law was clear. Gods could punish mortals freely, but they could not act without cause. Each god was bound to a domain, and to overstep it invited conflict from within the pantheon itself. Zeus ruled the sky and order. Hades governed death, but did not hasten it without reason. Even Ares, god of war, could not begin conflict without mortal hands lifting the first blade. This structure was enforced not by morality, but fear. Fear of another Titan war, fear of collapse, fear that if the gods lost restraint, the world itself would fracture again. And beneath Olympus, deeper still, older powers watched. The Titans were not fully gone. Their bodies lay broken, imprisoned, or transformed into the bones of the world itself. Mountains were not stone alone. They were remnants of defeated gods. Rivers followed paths carved by ancient battles. The earth remembered what the sky tried to forget. Mortals sensed this memory. Some cultures whispered of a time before Zeus, before order, before thunder ruled the heavens. These stories were discouraged, quietly erased, their speakers silenced not by death, but by disappearance. Knowledge in this world was dangerous when it pointed backward. This is how the gods preserved their age, not through lies, but through forgetting. Temples taught curated myths. Bards sang approved histories. The past was reshaped until the Titans became monsters, chaos incarnate, rather than rulers with flaws. Mortals were taught that divine order was the only possible order, and for a time it worked. Civilizations rose under divine guidance. Sparta forged warriors with Ares' blessing. Athens became a beacon of strategy and thought under Athena's watchful eye. Even distant lands felt Olympus's reach as gods extended influence beyond Greece, testing how far their authority could stretch. Yet even in this age of balance, something began to shift. The gods started to fear not mortal rebellion, but mortal independence.
Heroes emerged who did not beg for favor, but demanded it. Warriors who survived divine punishment. Kings who ruled wisely without constant guidance. Each success weakened the gods' grip, subtly but undeniably. Worship continued, but dependence lessened, and the gods, for the first time since the Titan War, felt uncertain. It was this uncertainty that led them to intervene more aggressively, to manipulate bloodlines, to shape destinies before mortals could choose them. Children of gods were born not out of love, but strategy. Fate itself became a tool, bent and redirected to ensure obedience. This is where the age began to darken, because when gods stopped trusting mortals, they stop walking beside them and begin walking over them. And somewhere in this tightening web of control, far from Olympus's golden halls, a warrior would be born into a world already trembling beneath divine footsteps. But that is not yet his story. For now, the gods still walk among mortals, and the world still believes this is how it must be. The gods remained among mortals not because they loved them, but because distance was dangerous. As the age progressed, divine presence became heavier, more deliberate. Where once a god's visit inspired awe, it now inspired caution. Mortals learned to read the signs of approaching divinity, the sudden stillness of air before Zeus descended, the metallic taste on the wind when Ares drew near, the quiet chill that followed Athena's gaze. These were not blessings, they were warnings. Olympus had entered a period of consolidation. After the Titan War, The gods had ruled through victory. Now they ruled through administration. Divine authority was no longer maintained solely by fear of punishment, by systems designed to bind mortal life ever closer to the pantheon. Oracles were elevated into instruments of policy. Prophecies were no longer rare glimpses of fate, but tools shaped, interpreted, and sometimes rewritten to guide entire civilizations. This was the first great system of control to fully mature, the manipulation of destiny. In this world, fate was real, but it was not absolute. The sisters of fate existed beyond Olympus, ancient and impartial, weaving destinies that even Zeus feared.
Yet the gods learned they could influence outcomes without cutting the thread itself. By shaping circumstances, by guiding births, wars, and alliances, they could funnel destiny toward acceptable ends. Mortals believed prophecy revealed truth. In reality, prophecy increasingly revealed intent. A king told he would fall in battle often marched sooner than he should have. A city warned of divine displeasure offered greater tribute. Knowledge altered behavior, and altered behavior reshaped fate. The gods did not need to rewrite destiny, they only needed mortals to fear it. This system worked quietly, efficiently, and it bred dependence. Temples grew larger, not merely as places of worship, but as centers of governance. Priests mediated disputes. Oracles legitimized rulers. Entire legal codes were justified as expressions of divine will. To disobey law became indistinguishable from disobeying the gods. Yet divine nearness also created friction within the pantheon itself. The Olympians were not unified in vision. Athena favored guidance and restraint. Ares thrived on chaos and saw constant conflict as proof of strength. Hera sought control through lineage and purity. Poseidon demanded respect through fear. Each god influenced mortals differently, pulling societies in conflicting directions. This rivalry manifested in proxy wars. Cities blessed by opposing gods found themselves drawn into conflict not of their own making. A harvest dispute became a holy war. A border skirmish escalated into annihilation. Mortals fought, believing they defended their gods, unaware they were reinforcing divine rivalries older than their histories. And beneath these conflicts, another system began to take shape, the divine economy of souls. Death, governed by Hades, was no longer merely an end, it became a ledger. Souls carried weight, emotional, symbolic, and metaphysical. Heroes who died gloriously strengthened the domains of war. Worshippers who lived in fear enriched the realms of judgment. Even despair had value. This is why suffering was never fully prevented. The gods did not desire extinction, they desired circulation. Mortals lived, struggled, died, and returned their essence to the cosmic balance that sustained divine realms. Too much peace starved the system. Too much chaos threatened collapse. The gods walked among mortals to regulate this flow, adjusting pain and prosperity like a careful, ruthless gardener. Some mortals began to sense this truth. Philosophers, warriors, and forgotten cults whispered that the gods did not protect humanity, they consumed it. These ideas were not openly punished, they were quietly neutralized. Their speakers vanished, their writings burned, their names erased from memory.
This marked the rise of controlled forgetting. Olympus learned that rebellion did not need to be crushed publicly.
It needed to be removed from history. Myths were edited, songs altered, the past softened until it no longer inspired resistance. Mortals remembered the gods as guardians, not wardens. Yet even forgetting leaves traces. In remote regions far from the shadow of Olympus, old practices survived. Shrines built not to Olympians, but to unnamed forces. Rituals that honored the earth itself, or the memory of titans, not as monsters, but as creators. These cultures lived cautiously, aware that attention invited correction. And still, the gods walked. They attended festivals, they judged contests, they rewarded loyalty with visible favor. But their presence grew colder, more measured, less personal. Mortals noticed the change first in heroes. The earliest heroes had been companions of gods, students, lovers, champions chosen for potential. Now heroes were weapons, their lives engineered through prophecy, their trials orchestrated to test limits, their victories claimed as proof of divine wisdom. When heroes failed, they were discarded. This is when resentment began to germinate, not openly, but inwardly. Mortals still prayed, still obeyed, but the warmth faded. Faith became transaction, obedience replaced devotion, and the gods felt it. Divinity in this world responds not to belief alone, but to emotional investment. Fear sustains power, but only temporarily. Over time, it corrodes the bond between ruler and subject. Olympus began to sense a thinning, a subtle weakening not of strength, but of legitimacy. To counter this, the gods drew closer still. They intervened more directly. Punishments became harsher, rewards more dramatic. Balance tipped toward domination. And with every step, the age when gods walked among mortals became less a shared existence and more an occupation. The world endured this strain quietly, but strain left unaddressed always seeks release. Somewhere within this tightening system of fate manipulated, history edited, souls counted, and lives engineered, a single contradiction began to form. A mortal shaped too perfectly by divine hands, a future that prophecy could not fully contain, and an age that would soon learn what happens when gods walk too close for too long. The fracture did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as exhaustion. After generations of divine nearness, mortals no longer feared the gods as forces of nature. They feared them as rulers who never left. The constant presence of judgment reshaped daily life into ritual compliance. Every harvest was weighed for offense, every victory examined for hubris. Even grief required permission. This was the moment when obedience stopped feeling sacred and began feeling compulsory. The first fracture appeared within the institutions Olympus trusted most. Oracles began to falter, not because the future grew unclear, but because mortals stopped acting upon prophecy with certainty. Kings delayed, warriors questioned omens, priests argued over interpretations. The divine system that relied on anticipation and fear encountered hesitation, and hesitation disrupted fate's flow. This exposed a critical truth. Prophecy required belief to function efficiently. Without belief, fate lost momentum. The gods responded by tightening their grip. Visions grew more vivid, punishments more immediate. But this only accelerated the erosion. Mortals learned that prophecy did not reveal inevitability, it revealed expectation, and expectation could be resisted. This resistance took its first organized form through hero cults. Unlike traditional worship, hero cults did not center on gods. They celebrated mortals who had survived divine trials, endured punishment, or acted independently of Olympus's will. These figures were not rebels, they were examples, living proof that survival outside absolute obedience was possible. The gods tolerated these cults initially. Heroes, after all, still served divine narratives, but something subtle had changed. Mortals began honoring resilience instead of favor, strength instead of blessing. The gods felt this shift immediately. Divine power in this world flows through recognition, not mere worship, but acknowledgement of authority. As admiration redirected toward mortal achievement, the gods' influence thinned, not enough to weaken them, but enough to unsettle them. This is when Olympus committed its greatest mistake of the age. Rather than withdraw, the gods escalated. They introduced conditional miracles, acts of divine intervention granted only through increasingly severe demonstrations of loyalty. Entire populations were tested. Cities were abandoned unless sacrifices increased. Faith became performance, and performance breeds resentment. Within Sparta, a city long shaped by Ares, this pressure manifested most clearly. Warriors were no longer trained to defend, but to prove devotion through brutality. Victory alone was insufficient.
Bloodshed became ritual. Mercy became weakness. The system of divine favor had transformed into a system of divine hunger. Ares thrived in this environment. Athena grew uneasy. Zeus observed, calculating. It was during this time that a deeper mechanism surfaced, the inheritance of divine consequence. Children born under intense divine influence began carrying traces of their parents' oaths, failures, and favors. Not blessings, burdens. Bloodlines became repositories of unresolved divine intent. Mortals inherited not power, but obligation. This marked a turning point in how the gods interacted with humanity. They no longer guided individuals, they engineered legacies. Entire families were shaped as instruments of future correction. If a city defied Olympus, its descendants would pay. If a god foresaw a threat generations away, they planted control far in advance. Fate became genealogical. Some mortals began to recognize this pattern. They noticed that certain families suffered endlessly, that tragedy clustered, that redemption was rare. These observations did not produce revolt, but they seeded quiet defiance. The gods answered with silence. Divine presence diminished not in visibility, but in warmth. Gods still appeared, but no longer explained. Commands replaced counsel. Edicts replaced guidance. Mortals were expected to obey without understanding. This eroded the final bond, trust. When mortals trust gods, suffering feels purposeful. When trust fades, suffering feels exploitative. The fracture widened.
In remote regions, warriors abandoned temples, cities fortified without prayer. Rituals continued outwardly, but belief hollowed from within. The gods remained powerful, yet increasingly isolated atop Olympus, surrounded by worship but starved of connection. This isolation bred paranoia. Zeus began to fear not rebellion, but irrelevance. Athena foresaw collapse through overreach. Ares demanded escalation, believing fear alone could restore order. The pantheon fractured internally, each god interpreting the crisis differently. And so they acted without unity. Contradictory commands spread across the world. One god demanded restraint, another demanded annihilation. Mortals caught between these orders suffered catastrophic consequences. Entire regions collapsed under divine contradiction. This chaos revealed a final, dangerous truth. The gods no longer governed the world. They competed for it. In this struggle, mortals ceased being subjects and became terrain.
It was within this climate of engineered bloodlines, hollow faith, and divine rivalry that a single life would emerge as the embodiment of contradiction. A warrior shaped perfectly by the old system, yet incompatible with its future. Not a rebel by ideology, not a savior by intent, but a consequence. The fracture was complete. The age when gods walked among mortals had crossed its threshold. The closeness that once preserved balance had corrupted it. And now the world moved toward an outcome no prophecy could safely contain. The gods did not create defiance by accident. They cultivated obedience so absolute that it could no longer bend. In the aftermath of the first fracture, Olympus shifted its strategy. The pantheon no longer trusted systems alone. Prophecy, priesthood, or tradition were deemed insufficient. Control had to be embodied, lived, enforced not through institutions, but through individuals shaped from birth to serve divine intent without question. This began the age of engineered loyalty. Mortal lives were no longer merely guided by the gods, they were authored by them. Births were influenced, unions encouraged or forbidden, and entire childhoods unfolded beneath divine observation. Certain mortals were selected not because they were exceptional, but because they were moldable. Strength could be taught, discipline could be enforced, doubt could be punished out of existence. Sparta became the clearest expression of this philosophy. Long before its greatest tragedy, Sparta was already a divine experiment, a society stripped of softness, where emotion was weakness and obedience was survival. Ares did not simply bless Sparta, he shaped it. The city's laws mirrored divine logic, purpose over mercy, victory over reflection, loyalty over truth. Children were taught not why they fought, but how well. This is how the gods learned a dangerous lesson. Mortals trained without moral context do not fear consequence, they accept it. Pain becomes routine, loss becomes expected, and when suffering is normalized, divine punishment loses its deterrent power. Obedience achieved through conditioning is stable only until it encounters contradiction. That contradiction emerged in the form of conflicting divine directives. As Olympus fractured internally, engineered warriors were sent into impossible situations. One god demanded conquest, another demanded restraint, a third demanded sacrifice. Mortals who lived by absolute obedience found themselves unable to satisfy all commands simultaneously. This created a crisis not of faith, but of logic. Warriors trained to obey without question suddenly faced questions without answers. When punishment followed regardless of action, obedience ceased to function as protection. It became a liability. The gods misinterpreted this moment. They believed mortals needed harsher correction, more spectacle, more fear, and so they escalated again. Divine punishment became exemplary rather than corrective. Entire families were destroyed to make a point. Cities were erased not for rebellion, but for hesitation. The gods no longer punished actions, they punished potential. This introduced a new system into the world, preventive suffering. By inflicting pain before defiance occurred, the gods hoped to preserve order, but this system carried a fatal flaw. Suffering without cause does not inspire obedience, it inspires resentment. Mortals began to internalize a new belief, quiet and unspoken. Survival no longer depended on pleasing the gods, it depended on enduring them. This belief did not spread through sermons or uprisings, it spread through shared trauma, through whispered stories of injustice, through the recognition that divine favor had become arbitrary, and Olympus remained blind to it. The gods still walked among mortals, but now they were watched rather than revered, observed rather than trusted. Mortals learned to perform faith convincingly, while privately detaching from it. Rituals continued, temples stood, but belief had become hollow ceremony. Divinity fed on presence, not sincerity, and it began to starve. This starvation manifested as instability. Gods grew more volatile, tempers flared faster, judgments became erratic. Without emotional connection to mortals, divine authority lost its grounding. Power remained immense but unanchored. Zeus sensed this instability most of all. As ruler of Olympus, his authority depended on unity, but unity had eroded. Athena questioned strategy. Hera pursued control through bloodlines. Ares demanded endless war. Poseidon withdrew into prideful isolation. Hades observed silently, bound by laws even Zeus dared not break. Zeus responded with control. He began shaping outcomes directly, bypassing councils and prophecy alike. Fate was still feared, but Zeus increasingly acted as if he stood above it. This arrogance, subtle at first, would later become catastrophic. But before collapse, there was design. The gods believed they could still solve the problem through a perfect mortal instrument, a being forged in suffering, loyal through conditioning, unstoppable through strength, someone who could enforce divine will without hesitation. This belief gave rise to the final phase of the age, the creation of living consequences. Mortals were no longer merely subjects, they became extensions of divine intent.
tools to correct other mortals, weapons to enforce balance through fear. Yet the gods misunderstood the nature of what they were creating. A being shaped entirely by obedience does not lack will, it lacks choice. And when choice is removed long enough, the first choice reclaimed is absolute rejection. The system had reached its limit. Divine nearness, once a source of balance, had become suffocating. The gods walked too closely, shaped too much, demanded too often. Mortals no longer saw them as necessary, they saw them as inevitable, and inevitability invites challenge. Somewhere within this system, this network of engineered loyalty, preventive suffering, and hollow faith, a life was unfolding exactly as the gods intended. They believed they were building a solution. They did not yet realize they were building an end. The gods believed obedience was silent. They did not realize it was listening. By the time Olympus understood that its systems were failing, the age itself had already changed. Divine nearness no longer produced harmony or fear, it produced pressure. And pressure, when unrelieved, always seeks form. This was the era in which obedience stopped being an abstract principle and began to crystallize into identity. For generations, mortals had been shaped to serve without question. Their pain was justified as preparation, their losses reframed as destiny. Over time, obedience ceased to feel imposed. It became internal. A voice that corrected thought before action, a rule that lived inside the body. This internalization was the gods' greatest success and their most dangerous error. Because once obedience becomes identity, it no longer needs divine presence to function. And once it no longer needs the gods, it begins to judge them. The first signs appeared in the nature of warriors themselves. Engineered fighters no longer sought divine approval in battle. They fought with mechanical precision, indifferent to blessing or curse. Victory became personal, not sacred. War was no longer offered to the gods, it was endured for survival. Ares mistook this for devotion. He believed endless bloodshed strengthened his domain. In truth, war had lost its ritual meaning. It was no longer a bridge between mortal and divine realms. It was labor, brutal, repetitive, and empty. This subtle shift drained the spiritual value of conflict. The divine economy of souls, once balanced through emotional resonance, began to destabilize. Death still occurred, but it no longer carried reverence. Souls arrived hardened, stripped of awe, resistant to judgment. Hades noticed first. The underworld grew restless. Judgment required acknowledgement of authority. Souls that no longer recognized divine legitimacy resisted classification. They did not beg, they did not bargain, they waited, silent, heavy, unresolved. This forced Hades to alter his realm. New divisions emerged, new torments designed not to punish, but to extract response. The underworld became less a place of order and more a mechanism of containment. This change rippled upward, weakening the metaphysical structure that separated life from death. The gods had not anticipated this consequence. Divine authority, they learned too late, depended not on control, but on meaning. As meaning eroded, the gods intensified surveillance. Mortal lives were monitored more closely, dreams invaded, emotions manipulated, signs and omens multiplied. The gods attempted to remind mortals of their presence by never letting them forget it. But omnipresence does not inspire reverence, it breeds fatigue. This fatigue manifested culturally. Songs grew darker, myths shifted tone. Heroes were no longer praised for obedience, but for endurance. The ideal mortal changed, from favored champion to unbreakable survivor. Even children's stories reflected this shift, teaching resilience rather than devotion. Olympus dismissed this as harmless evolution. It was not. It was preparation. Within Sparta, the system reached its most extreme expression. Children were taught not only to obey orders, but to suppress doubt entirely. Reflection was weakness.
Emotion was liability. Identity was purpose. This produced warriors of unprecedented efficiency and unprecedented emptiness. A being raised without choice does not dream of freedom. They dream of release. The gods failed to understand the psychological consequence of their design. They believed they were creating perfect instruments. Instead, they were creating closed systems, minds with no space for negotiation, compromise, or reinterpretation. Such minds cannot coexist with inconsistent authority. When divine commands conflicted, these warriors did not question which god was right. They questioned why gods failed to agree. This question marked a turning point. For the first time, mortals evaluated the gods not as absolutes, but as fallible actors within a system. And once evaluated, they could be judged. Judgment did not lead immediately to defiance. It led to something more dangerous: indifference. Indifference starves power faster than rebellion. Worship continued outwardly, but inwardly mortals detached. Sacrifices were offered without belief, prayers spoken without expectation, divine signs observed without awe. The gods walked among mortals yet felt unseen. This invisibility destabilized them. Gods accustomed to acknowledgement reacted poorly to irrelevance. Ares became more violent, Hera more controlling, Zeus more paranoid, Athena more withdrawn. Olympus, once unified through shared rule, became a fractured court of insecure rulers, and insecurity breeds cruelty. Punishments escalated again, but now without clarity. Mortals were punished not for disobedience, but for uncertainty. Cities were destroyed to reassert presence, catastrophes unleashed to demand recognition, yet each act deepened the divide. The gods did not realize they were no longer correcting behavior. They were confirming mortal suspicion that divine power existed not to protect order, but to preserve itself. This realization spread quietly, not through revolt, but through resignation. Mortals stopped asking why, and in a world governed by fate, prophecy, and divine intent, the most dangerous force is not rebellion, but inevitability questioned.
The age when gods walked among mortals had reached its irreversible stage. Obedience, perfected and internalized, had matured beyond control. It had learned its own shape, its own endurance. Soon it would learn its own name. And when it did, the gods would finally understand the cost of walking too close to those they ruled. The gods had always believed that punishment was final. From the earliest days after the Titan War, divine authority rested on a simple certainty. Any challenge could be answered with consequence. Lightning silenced kings, floods erased cities, madness shattered heroes who dared look too closely at Olympus. The system was crude, but effective. Fear closed questions before they could form. But this certainty relied on one condition, that punishment still mattered. By the time this age reached its later years, that condition no longer held. Mortals had endured punishment for so long that it had lost its instructional power. Pain no longer redirected behavior. Loss no longer inspired obedience. The gods continued to punish, but the world no longer adjusted itself around that punishment. Life simply absorbed it. This was the moment divine authority encountered its first true limitation. The gods noticed it first in prophecy. Visions grew unstable. Outcomes once clear now appeared fractured, branching into possibilities that refused to collapse into certainty. The sisters of fate continued to weave, but the threads resisted tension. When pulled too tightly, they snapped, not catastrophically, but quietly, forcing the loom to reconfigure. Fate, long treated as a guarantee, had become conditional. This terrified Olympus. Zeus demanded greater oversight of prophetic interpretation. Athena sought deeper analysis. Ares dismissed the concern entirely, insisting that strength alone could force destiny back into alignment. None of them fully understood the underlying cause. Mortals had stopped aligning themselves with predicted outcomes. They no longer shaped their lives around prophecy. Some ignored it, others deliberately acted against it, not out of defiance, but exhaustion. Fate had ceased to feel meaningful. It felt manipulative. Without participation, fate weakened. The gods attempted to compensate through direct intervention. They appeared more frequently, corrected events in real time, and imposed outcomes by force. But forced outcomes lack resonance. They produce results without legitimacy. This legitimacy crisis spread into the divine hierarchy itself. Gods derive power not only from worship, but from recognition of their right to rule. As mortals withdrew emotionally, the gods began competing openly for relevance. Displays of power grew theatrical. Punishments grew symbolic rather than effective. Olympus transformed from a governing body into a stage. And stages demand audiences. The absence of genuine awe destabilized divine psychology. Gods accustomed to reverence began interpreting indifference as insult. This triggered a feedback loop of escalation. Each god sought to prove indispensability through increasingly destructive acts. Yet every act confirmed the same conclusion. The gods could harm the world, but they could no longer guide it. This realization crystallized into a new, dangerous understanding among mortals. Divine power could be survived. Once this idea took hold, the metaphysical order shifted. Survival altered the meaning of divinity. Gods were no longer inevitabilities. They were forces, vast, destructive, but finite. And finite forces can be opposed, avoided, or endured. This shift did not create rebellion, it created adaptation. Mortals learned to live around divine interference. Cities relocated, cultures diversified worship to avoid singular dependence. Warriors trained to withstand divine punishment rather than avoid it. Knowledge spread quietly. What angered which god? What signs preceded catastrophe? What sacrifices delayed disaster longest? The gods watched this adaptation with growing unease. Their authority had depended on unpredictability. Once patterns emerged, fear weakened. Once fear weakened, power thinned. This thinning manifested physically. Gods tired more quickly. Their interventions required greater effort. Healing slowed. Rage lingered. The divine body, once sustained effortlessly by belief, now demanded energy to maintain. Olympus was not collapsing, but it was straining. Zeus responded with consolidation. He centralized authority, limiting the autonomy of other gods. Decisions that once involved council became decrees. This angered the pantheon, but none openly opposed him. They still feared Zeus. Fear remained effective among gods longer than among mortals. But fear corrodes loyalty. Athena withdrew strategically, limiting her interventions. Poseidon retreated into prideful isolation. Hera focused obsessively on lineage, believing control of bloodlines could restore stability. Ares grew reckless, seeking meaning in ever greater destruction. Hades alone remained consistent. Bound by laws older than Olympus, he observed without escalation. He saw what others refused to see, that divine authority was not being challenged by rebellion, but outgrown by endurance. The world had learned to exist beneath divine weight without internalizing it. This was the authority the gods could not punish. No lightning could erase it, no flood could drown it, no prophecy could redirect it. It lived quietly in the minds of mortals who no longer asked permission to survive. And in such a world, the greatest threat to divine order was not a challenger, but a consequence.
A being shaped entirely by divine systems, yet no longer responsive to them. Not because he rejected the gods, but because punishment had taught him nothing left to fear. The age when gods walked among mortals had reached its point of inversion. Divine nearness no longer preserved order, it exposed fragility. And soon the gods would confront the final truth of this age, that power sustained through control eventually creates something control cannot contain. Before the world learned to whisper the names of gods in fear, before temples became ruins and prayers became echoes, the gods of God of War walked openly among mortals. This is a world shaped by divine hands, not a distant pantheon watching from the heavens, but living powers whose footsteps cracked stone, whose voices bent fate, and whose emotions scarred the land itself. In the God of War universe, gods were never abstract ideas. They were rulers,
generals, judges, and executioners. They lived close enough to humanity that their shadows fell across cities at noon. To understand this age, one must first understand the world itself. The realms of God of War are not merely places on a map. They are layers of reality, bound together by ancient laws older than the gods who rule them. In the earliest era, long before Kratos would become a name whispered in terror, the Greek world existed as a single, tightly bound, divine system. Olympus stood at its center, not only as a mountain, but as a cosmic anchor. When Olympus flourished, reality itself remained stable. When Olympus trembled, the world followed. In those days, gods drew power directly from mortal belief. But belief alone was not enough. What truly sustained divine strength was interaction. Gods were strongest when they intervened, when they judged disputes, led wars, or punished defiance. Distance weakened them, silence starved them. That is why they ruled so closely. A god unseen was a god fading. This created the first great system of the age, the cycle of divine presence. Every god was bound by an unspoken law. To remain immortal in truth, they had to be present in the world they ruled. Zeus ruled from Olympus, but he descended often. Ares walked battlefields. Athena advised kings in person. Poseidon rose from the sea to shatter cities that defied him. Their immortality was not passive, it was maintained through action. Mortals, in turn, were not merely victims, they were participants. Cities rose not by human ingenuity alone, but by divine favor, carefully earned or violently taken. Each city-state aligned itself with a patron god, shaping its culture, laws, and warfare around that deity's nature. A city favored by Athena prized discipline and wisdom. A city favored by Ares glorified conquest and bloodshed. Over generations, this alignment altered even architecture. Stone walls mirrored divine ideals. Temples were built not for worship alone, but as conduits, anchors that allowed gods to cross into the mortal world with less resistance. This brings us to the second system that defined the age, divine conduits. Temples were not symbolic, they were functional. Each major temple acted as a finning point between realms, allowing gods to manifest more fully. When a god entered the mortal world near their own temple, they arrived with greater strength, clarity, and permanence. Without such anchors, manifestations were brief and unstable. This is why wars were often fought over holy ground. To destroy a rival god's temple was not merely an insult, it weakened them, it severed their influence. Entire campaigns were waged not for territory, but to collapse a divine presence, slowly, stone by stone. Yet even gods were not truly free. Above Olympus, unseen by mortals and feared even by the gods themselves, existed the threads of fate. The sisters of fate did not rule openly, but their power surpassed even Zeus's authority. Fate in this world was not prophecy, it was structure. Time itself was woven, layered, and reinforced. Events that seemed like choices were often corrections, pulling reality back into its intended shape. This created tension at the heart of the divine order. Gods could act, but only within boundaries they did not create. They could punish mortals, but not erase destiny. They could wage wars, but not change outcomes already woven. This limitation fueled divine cruelty. Knowing they were powerful yet restrained, gods often overcompensated and forcing control where they could. It is here that the age begins to darken. As gods ruled more harshly, mortal suffering intensified. Entire populations were sacrificed to appease God's anger. Plagues were sent not as punishment for sin, but as reminders of power. The gods did not need mortals to be happy, they needed them to fear and remember. And yet something unexpected occurred. Mortals began to learn, not magic as gods wielded it, but fragments, rituals, sigils, forbidden knowledge scavenged from divine remnants. When a god bled, the earth absorbed it. When a god died, reality remembered. Relics formed.
Weapons retained will. Magic seeped into bloodlines. This marks the third critical system of the age: inherited divinity. Power, once exclusive to gods, began to leak into the mortal world. Champions rose, not chosen by fate, but forged by exposure. Warriors who survived divine battles returned changed. Their strength exceeded human limits. Their rage bent reality. Their souls became heavy, marked by divine proximity. The gods noticed, and they grew afraid, not because mortals could rival them yet, but because the world itself was changing. Divine power was no longer contained. The more the gods interfered, the more traces they left behind. The age of open rule was beginning to rot from within. Olympus still stood radiant. The gods still walked among mortals. But beneath the marble and gold, the foundations were cracking. And somewhere in this age, still unnamed, still unbroken, a mortal was being shaped by war, betrayal, and the silent indifference of the gods. The world had not yet learned his name, but the age that allowed gods to walk among mortals was already sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The age did not collapse all at once. It hardened. As Olympus sensed the slow leakage of divine power into the mortal world, the gods did not retreat. They tightened their grip. What had once been presence became enforcement. What had once been guidance became decree. Thus began the era when divine rule transformed into divine law, enforced not through faith, but through inevitability. This shift marked a quiet but decisive change in how gods governed mortals. No longer content to rule through patronage alone, the Olympians imposed a unified structure upon the world. Mortal kings were no longer merely favored, they were appointed. Cities no longer negotiated devotion, they were assigned allegiance. The gods began to treat the world not as a living realm, but as an extension of Olympus itself. This introduced a new system that would define the age, the hierarchy of divine authority. At its peak stood Zeus, not merely as king of gods, but as arbiter of reality's balance. Beneath him, each god was granted a domain, not only of nature, but of governance. Athena oversaw law, wisdom, and sanctioned warfare. Poseidon governed seas and all trade that crossed them. Ares was given authority over conflict itself, not just battlefields, but the right to incite war when divine interests required it. These domains were not symbolic, they were juridical. A city that waged war without Ares' sanction invited disaster. A fleet that sailed without honoring Poseidon risked annihilation. A ruler who ignored Athena's counsel found their strategies unraveling as if foresight itself had abandoned them. Divine law rewrote causality. Mortals did not merely fear the gods anymore, they were bound to them. Choices narrowed, outcomes became predictable. Civilization advanced, but only along paths approved by Olympus. Yet this structure carried a flaw the gods could not see. The more rigid divine law became, the less adaptable the world grew. Mortal societies stagnated under the weight of inevitability. Innovation slowed, culture ossified. Even worship became procedural, stripped of wonder. Temples turned from living conduits into administrative centers, places where offerings were calculated, not felt. This spiritual decay weakened the cycle of divine presence itself. Gods found themselves intervening more often to maintain control, which only accelerated the leakage of divine remnants into the world. Every punishment left scars, every miracle left residue. Reality absorbed these actions like wounds that never fully healed. It was during this time that Olympus created another mechanism to preserve dominance: divine servitors. These were not gods, nor fully mortal. Chosen champions were altered through ritual and binding oaths, infused with controlled fragments of divine power. Unlike uncontrolled inheritance, servitors were tethered. Their strength flowed from Olympus and could be withdrawn. They became judges, enforcers, and executioners, walking reminders that divine law was not abstract. But servitors paid a price. Bound to gods who did not age, they lived suspended between humanity and eternity. Their bodies endured beyond natural limits, but their minds fractured. Memories dulled, identity eroded. Many forgot why they served at all, remembering only the command. These beings spread fear, but also resentment. Mortals began to whisper a dangerous idea that the gods no longer ruled to protect the world, but to preserve themselves. And then something unprecedented occurred. A god was challenged, not by another god, but by defiance that fate did not correct. In a distant city, a mortal ruler refused a divine decree, not in ignorance, not in desperation, but deliberately. He destroyed the temple that anchored his patron god, knowing the consequences. When the god descended to punish him, the expected correction did not occur.
The threads of fate remained still. The god triumphed. The city burned, but the world did not realign. This was subtle, almost invisible, yet it sent shockwaves through Olympus. For the first time, the gods confronted the possibility that fate itself was loosening. The sisters of fate had not intervened. Whether by choice or limitation, no one could say, but the implication was terrifying. If fate could allow defiance to stand, even briefly, then divine law was no longer absolute. In response, Zeus ordered a consolidation of power unseen before. Olympus withdrew from shared governance and centralized authority. Lesser gods were stripped of autonomy. Decisions once debated became commands. The pantheon hardened into an empire. This birthed another critical system,
the suppression of knowledge. Artifacts that allowed mortals to glimpse divine mechanisms were destroyed or hidden. Records of past ages were erased. Oracles were silenced or repurposed. Even the language of fate was restricted, only taught within Olympus itself. The gods sought to make the world forget that it had ever been different. But forgetting does not erase truth, it only buries it. As knowledge vanished, memory survived in other forms. Songs, bloodlines, curses passed quietly from parent to child. Divine remnants embedded themselves into the land, into stone, fire, and sea. And among these remnants, one force grew stronger than Olympus anticipated: rage. Not the simple anger of mortals, but a sustained, focused fury born from betrayal, loss, and helplessness. Rage resonated with the divine in a way no other emotion did. It amplified inherited power, it broke restraints, it destabilized bindings. The gods recognized rage as dangerous, yet they misunderstood its source. They believed rage was a flaw in mortals. In truth, it was a response to divine cruelty. Somewhere in this tightening world, where law crushed choice and gods ruled without reflection, a mortal life was being shaped by this imbalance. A life touched by war, not as glory, but as obligation. A life trained by gods who saw usefulness, not humanity. The age of gods walking among mortals had become something else entirely. It was now an age where gods stood above mortals, unquestioned, unchallenged, and increasingly afraid of what they had created. And fear in gods would soon lead to catastrophe. Fear does not announce itself in gods the way it does in mortals. It does not tremble, it calculates. When Olympus realized that rage could bypass bindings, that fate could hesitate, and that mortals could carry divine residue without sanction, the gods did not react with chaos.
They reacted with planning, quietly, methodically. This was the beginning of what later histories would mistake as stability, but which was in truth preparation for eradication. The first decision Zeus made was not destruction, but classification. Mortals were no longer seen as a single mass. Olympus began to separate humanity into categories: worshippers, servants, threats, and anomalies. Those who displayed inherited divinity, unnatural endurance, strength, or resistance to divine influence were no longer tolerated as accidents. They became subjects of observation. Thus emerged a hidden system that few mortals ever understood: the divine audit. Through oracles, dreams, and manipulated omens, Olympus tracked individuals who deviated from mortal norms. These people were not struck down immediately. Instead, they were guided toward war, hardship, and impossible trials. The gods wished to see something specific. They wanted to know whether power born outside Olympus could be controlled. Many failed. Their bodies burned out, their minds shattered. Those who survived became legends, heroes praised publicly but privately catalogued. Their victories fed Olympus valuable data. Every triumph revealed limits. Every failure confirmed assumptions. Yet the audit uncovered something far more troubling. Some mortals did not merely survive divine pressure, they adapted to it. These individuals showed signs of resistance to fate itself. Prophecies surrounding them grew vague. Oracles contradicted one another. Outcomes became unstable. The Sisters of Fate, once precise beyond question, began weaving threads thicker and more redundant around certain lives, as if compensating for uncertainty. This revealed a truth the gods had long ignored. Fate was not a cage. It was a structure maintained through consensus. The more divine systems fractured, law, presence, knowledge, the more effort fate required to remain intact. And in places where suffering grew extreme, fate thinned. Rage, grief, and relentless violence distorted the weave. This revelation terrified Olympus. If mortals could weaken fate simply by enduring divine cruelty long enough, then the gods were no longer rulers of inevitability. They were participants in a failing system. To correct this, Zeus authorized a measure that would permanently alter the relationship between gods and mortals: selective annihilation.
Cities suspected of producing anomalies were erased, not punished, not warned, removed. Poseidon swallowed coasts. Hades claimed populations en masse. Plagues were engineered not as retribution, but as sterilization. History was rewritten so these places were remembered only as myths, or never at all. But this strategy produced an unintended consequence. By erasing entire cultures, Olympus destroyed context. Survivors wandered without lineage, without gods to worship, without meaning. These displaced mortals carried trauma unanchored by tradition or faith. Their rage had no ritual release, no divine framework. It fermented. From this chaos emerged another dangerous development: godless warriors. These were fighters who no longer sought favor, prophecy, or blessing. They fought not for glory, but survival. Without divine allegiance, their actions fell further outside fate's influence. The sisters could see their threads, but not predict their knots. Olympus responded by empowering Ares. War, once a domain, became an instrument. Ares was tasked not with winning wars, but with prolonging them. Endless conflict ensured that dangerous mortals would die young before their power stabilized. Battlefields became crucibles designed to burn away anomalies. Yet war has a memory. Each conflict layered trauma upon trauma. Entire generations were raised knowing nothing but violence. Children learned to fight before they learned to speak. In such conditions, rage did not fade, it matured. And rage, unlike fear or devotion, did not require belief. It was during this era that the gods made their greatest miscalculation. They assumed rage was temporary. They did not understand that sustained injustice creates something far more dangerous than rebellion. It creates purpose divorced from hope. Mortals who no longer expected mercy, reward, or meaning became unpredictable. Some of these warriors began to reject even the idea of gods. They did not deny their existence, they denied their authority. This ideological fracture weakened the cycle of divine presence further. Gods found their manifestations thinner, more volatile. Temples lost resonance, conduits flickered. Olympus itself began to feel distant from the world it ruled.
In response, Zeus tightened his control over divine bloodlines. Gods were forbidden from siring uncontrolled offspring. Demigods were either bound into servitude or eliminated early. Divine lineage became regulated, recorded, and monitored. What had once been indulgence became liability. Yet this too failed. Divine blood, once spilled, does not obey law. It remembers violence. It responds to trauma. And when mixed with mortal suffering, it produces beings who do not see gods as parents, but as sources of pain. Somewhere within this brutal, managed chaos, a mortal child was growing beneath the shadow of war. Not blessed, not chosen, simply used, trained to kill in service of gods who saw him as a solution to a problem they had created. He would be taught obedience. He would be rewarded for brutality. He would be praised for rage. And in doing so, Olympus would unknowingly shape the very force that would bring the age of gods walking among mortals to its violent end. The war before the war was already underway. By the time Olympus recognized that fear had replaced reverence, it was already too late to reverse the damage. The gods could no longer rule through awe alone. They required compliance, and compliance, they believed, could still be manufactured. This belief led to the most consequential system the gods ever created: divine bargaining. Unlike worship, which was collective and diffuse, bargaining was personal. A god would identify a mortal in crisis, one already broken by war, grief, or desperation, and offer intervention. Not salvation, a transaction. The mortal received power, protection, or victory. The god received loyalty, silence, and continued presence in the world. These bargains were never written, they were carved into souls. Unlike servitors who were bound through ritual, bargained mortals remained technically free. This illusion was critical. A servant obeys because they must. A bargained mortal obeys because they believes they chose to. The gods learned quickly that belief created stronger chains than law ever could. This system spread quietly. Warriors were offered survival, kings were offered dominance, families were offered safety. Each bargain was tailored, intimate, and irreversible. The more desperate the mortal, the stronger the bond formed. Yet divine bargaining carried a hidden flaw. The gods assumed that power granted could be power withdrawn, but power given through bargain was not clean. It fused with identity. Victory reshaped memory. Each triumph reinforced the mortal's sense of self as separate from ordinary humanity. Over time, these individuals no longer saw themselves as tools.
They saw themselves as necessary, and necessity breeds entitlement. Olympus began to see signs of instability. Bargained warriors questioned orders. Kings challenged divine counsel. Heroes demanded more than promised. Each request was small but cumulative. Power had altered perception. Mortals who carried divine strength no longer felt fragile, and without fragility, fear diminished. In response, the gods layered bargains atop bargains, tightening control through dependency. They engineered losses to renew desperation. Victories were followed by punishment, just severe enough to reinforce obedience.
This manipulation reshaped mortal psychology across entire regions. Communities learned that gods rewarded suffering more reliably than peace. Families internalized the belief that sacrifice was currency. Grief became transactional. The world hardened into a place where pain was not merely endured, but leveraged. This era produced another quiet transformation, the normalization of divine violence. When gods killed, it was framed as balance. When cities fell, it was destiny. Mortals learned to rationalize catastrophe because resistance offered nothing but extinction. Over generations, this acceptance rewrote moral frameworks. Cruelty ceased to shock. Mercy became suspicious. Even the gods themselves changed. Olympians who once argued over justice now debated efficiency. The question was no longer whether punishment was deserved, but whether it achieved compliance. Athena refined strategies for psychological control. Poseidon calculated devastation with surgical precision. Hades expanded his domain not out of hunger, but logistics. The underworld itself evolved. Once a place of judgment and rest, it became increasingly populated by the prematurely dead, victims of divine experiments, prolonged wars, and engineered disasters. This influx strained its structure. Souls arrived fragmented, saturated with rage, unable to forget their lives. To manage this, Hades implemented soul stratification. The dead were no longer judged solely by deeds, but by utility.
Some were allowed rest. Others were bound to eternal labor, reinforcing the underworld's architecture. A select few, those marked by exceptional rage or endurance, were preserved, watched, and studied. The gods were beginning to treat souls as resources. This shift rippled back into the living world. Death lost its finality. Mortals sensed that something waited beyond it, not peace, but continuation. Fear of dying lessened. Fear of living under gods did not. Meanwhile, fate strained further. The Sisters of Fate responded by reinforcing threads around key divine assets. Certain lives were wrapped in redundancy, preventing premature ends. These individuals could survive wounds that should have killed them. Their timelines resisted interruption. Fate compensated for divine overreach, but this compensation created tension. When fate reinforces a life repeatedly, it concentrates probability. Events bend toward that individual. Battles gather around them. Tragedy follows them. Their existence becomes a focal point for consequence. Some mortals began to notice this pattern. They did not understand fate, but they recognized inevitability. These individuals stopped praying for mercy. Instead, they embraced their role as instruments of outcome. They became terrifying not because they were powerful, but because they expected catastrophe and acted without hesitation. Olympus mistook this for success. The gods believed they had forged perfect weapons. Mortals shaped by war, sustained by rage, and bound by bargains. They failed to see that obedience born from manipulation lacks loyalty. It endures only until the cost outweighs the fear, and that moment was approaching. Somewhere within this broken system, a mortal warrior stood at the center of countless bargains he never fully understood. Every victory reinforced his worth. Every loss deepened his dependence. He believed his suffering served a greater purpose. The gods encouraged this belief. They whispered that obedience would bring peace, that service would spare loved ones, that sacrifice was noble. They did not consider what would happen when that belief collapsed. Because when a bargained mortal realizes the bargain was a lie, the power granted does not vanish, it turns inward. Betrayal does not arrive suddenly, it gathers evidence. For generations, mortals had accepted loss as the cost of divine order. Children died in wars blessed by Ares. Cities drowned under Poseidon's wrath. Families vanished into Hades' domain without explanation. Each tragedy was absorbed into ritual, spoken of in hymns and offerings, softened by tradition.
But the age of bargaining changed how loss was experienced. When gods promised protection in exchange for obedience, suffering stopped being abstract. It became personal. Each bargain narrowed the distance between cause and consequence. A mortal who obeyed and still lost everything did not grieve blindly. They began to ask a forbidden question: why? The unraveling began not with rebellion, but with realization. Warriors who had served faithfully noticed patterns. Victories always demanded escalation. Mercy was never rewarded. Promises shifted in wording, never in meaning. The gods spoke in certainty, yet acted in convenience. Protection applied selectively. Punishment arrived without warning. Faith, once communal, fractured into individual reckonings. This shift marked the emergence of a new psychological system in the world: personal accountability for the divine. Mortals no longer judged gods by myth or legacy. They judged them by outcome, by whether their prayers were answered, by whether obedience mattered. The gods had trained mortals to think transactionally, and now those same mortals measured divine failure with ruthless clarity. Olympus responded poorly. Rather than address doubt, the gods intensified control. Oracles were rewritten, prophecies adjusted. Failures were blamed on mortal weakness. The narrative hardened. If a bargain failed, the mortal must have faltered. But this explanation no longer satisfied those who had lost everything. In several regions, temples were abandoned, not destroyed, ignored. Offerings dwindled. Rituals became empty gestures performed out of habit, not belief. The cycle of divine presence weakened further, not through defiance, but indifference. This indifference alarmed the gods more than rebellion ever had. A god can punish defiance, they cannot punish apathy. To counter this erosion, Zeus authorized a brutal corrective measure: exemplary catastrophe. Rather than subtle manipulation, Olympus would demonstrate consequence openly. Entire populations were punished not for disobedience, but as warnings. Cities that showed declining worship were annihilated publicly. Survivors were spared only to spread the message. But this strategy collapsed upon itself. Witnesses did not return humbled, they returned hollow. They spoke not of fear, but emptiness, of gods who demanded loyalty but offered no meaning, of power that destroyed without justification. These stories spread faster than prayers ever had. Even among the gods, fractures appeared. Athena questioned whether endless control was sustainable. Hades warned that the underworld could not absorb infinite violence without destabilizing reality itself. Ares, intoxicated by constant war, began to lose distinction between strategy and indulgence. Zeus silenced dissent. Authority once shared became unilateral. Olympus transformed fully into a hierarchy of command rather than counsel. Decisions were issued, not debated. The gods no longer ruled as a family, but as an occupying force. This consolidation produced another unintended consequence: divine isolation. As Olympus withdrew into itself, gods spent less time among mortals. Their manifestations weakened. Their understanding of the world they ruled grew abstract. Mortals became numbers. Outcomes became acceptable losses. The gods believed distance would restore reverence. Instead, it destroyed empathy. During this period, the most dangerous realization of all took hold among certain mortals. The gods were not cruel because they were evil. They were cruel because they were detached. This realization changed everything. Hatred can be redirected. Fear can be manipulated, but clarity cannot be undone. Warriors who reached this understanding no longer fought to please gods or defy them. They fought to end the cycle, not through ideology, but through elimination. Gods were no longer parents, judges, or inevitabilities. They were sources of harm. This mindset spread quietly, invisibly. No banners were raised, no rebellions declared. These mortals did not seek victory, they sought finality. Olympus failed to notice the shift because it did not resemble previous threats. There were no organized movements, no demands, no appeals, only individuals who stopped praying. Meanwhile, divine bargains began to collapse from within. Mortals bound by promises realized the truth. The gods could not undo what they had already given. Power fused to the soul resisted withdrawal. Attempts to reclaim it caused backlash, instability, uncontrolled rage, reality fractures. Each failed reclamation proved the same thing. The gods were not omnipotent, they were improvising. This realization reached a single warrior with devastating clarity. He had served longer than most, obeyed without question, sacrificed without hesitation. His identity had been shaped entirely around usefulness. Victory had been his purpose, obedience his meaning. When the final betrayal came, it was not dramatic, it was mundane. A promise broken, a family lost, a reward withheld. And in that quiet moment, faith collapsed. What followed was not grief, but alignment. Everything he had endured suddenly made sense. The suffering was not necessary. The bargains were never fair. The gods had shaped him into a weapon without considering what weapons do when they are no longer pointed. Rage, once nurtured as a tool, became autonomous. For the first time, divine power flowed without guidance, without permission, without restraint. Fate tightened around him instinctively, attempting to contain the outcome. The sisters reinforced his thread again and again, but each reinforcement made him heavier in the world. Events bent toward him, not because he was chosen, but because he was inevitable. Olympus would soon realize its mistake. The age when gods walked among mortals taught humanity how to endure divine cruelty. It had taught them how to survive gods. What it had not prepared the gods for was this: a mortal who no longer feared losing everything, because everything had already been taken. There is a moment in every collapsing system when correction is no longer possible, not because power is insufficient, but because recognition comes too late. Olympus reached that moment when inevitability stopped being theoretical. For generations, the gods had relied on the same assumption that mortals, no matter how powerful, would eventually break, that rage would exhaust itself, that loss would either destroy the bearer or push them back into obedience. This belief was not born of arrogance alone. It had always been true, until it wasn't. What the gods failed to understand was that rage changes when it is no longer fueled by hope. The warrior who now moved through the world was not seeking restoration. He did not pray for absolution or justice. He did not imagine a future where the gods apologized or withdrew. His rage had passed beyond reaction and entered a new state, direction. This was the final transformation Olympus had never encountered before. Rage, when shaped long enough by betrayal, becomes intention. The first sign that something had shifted came not from battle, but from silence. Oracles failed to speak clearly when his name approached their visions. Prophecies fragmented mid-sentence. The Sisters of Fate found themselves reinforcing the same thread repeatedly, only to watch it strain against their weaving. Every attempt to stabilize his path increased the pressure elsewhere in the tapestry. Fate was no longer guiding events, it was bracing against them. This revealed a deeper truth about the world's structure. Fate was not an author, it was a regulator. It could encourage outcomes, delay consequences, and soften catastrophes, but it could not eliminate momentum once enough force accumulated. The warrior had become momentum incarnate. As he moved, systems collapsed not through confrontation, but incompatibility. Divine servitors failed to restrain him because their bindings were designed for obedience, not resistance. Temples destabilized when he entered their presence, their conduits unable to reconcile divine authority with defiant power rooted in betrayal. Even the land reacted. Places scarred by divine violence responded to him differently. Ruined cities resonated with his presence. Battlefields grew restless. Weapons forged in earlier divine wars awakened, as if recognizing continuity. The world itself, saturated with abandoned power and unresolved trauma, began aligning around him. This marked the emergence of a new, unintentional system, environmental memory. The land remembered the gods' excesses. Every miracle, punishment, and catastrophe had left an imprint. These imprints, long dormant, now found coherence in the presence of someone who embodied their cause. Power flowed not from Olympus, but from accumulated consequence. The gods sensed this shift too late. When Zeus finally ordered direct intervention, it was no longer a demonstration of authority, it was containment. Gods descended not to rule, but to stop something already unfolding. Their manifestations were forceful but unstable, strained by distance, weakened conduits, and fading belief. The world resisted them. Each divine appearance required greater effort. Each withdrawal left greater residue. The cycle of divine presence had inverted. Gods now lost strength by intervening rather than gaining it. This inversion terrified Olympus. For the first time, gods experienced what mortals always had, diminishing returns. Effort no longer guaranteed outcome. Power no longer ensured compliance. Intervention accelerated decay.
In response, the gods made a final, desperate decision. They would isolate the anomaly completely. This led to the creation of containment sanctums, sealed regions saturated with divine law, fate reinforcement, and controlled reality distortion. These places were designed to trap beings whose existence threatened systemic balance.
Within them, causality was rigid. Outcomes were forced, choice narrowed to nothing. But containment requires cooperation. The warrior did not fight the sanctum, he endured it. He survived in conditions meant to erase will. He adapted to laws designed to suppress motion. His rage did not explode outward, it condensed. Every failed execution, every reinforced thread, every delayed death added density to his presence. Containment failed not because it was breached, but because it could not resolve him. When he finally emerged, it was not through escape, it was through collapse. The sanctum tore itself apart, trying to hold something it was never designed to process. Fate snapped locally, rewove itself hastily, and left scars that would never heal. Time stuttered, space warped. The gods watching from afar understood the implication immediately. If containment could not end him, nothing short of erasure could. Yet erasure was no longer possible. The warrior's existence was now woven too deeply into reality. His life intersected too many threads. Too many outcomes depended on his continuation. To remove him would unravel not just fate, but structure. The Sisters of Fate, for the first time, hesitated openly. This hesitation was witnessed. Gods felt it, mortals sensed it, the world absorbed it. Authority cracked. As news of divine failure spread, not through proclamation, but through survival, something ancient awakened in humanity. Permission. Permission to question, permission to resist, permission to imagine a world not organized around divine cruelty. This was not rebellion, it was awakening. Olympus responded with fury, but fury without clarity is inefficient. Gods argued openly, domains overlapped chaotically. Athena's strategies conflicted with Ares' indulgence. Poseidon's devastation interfered with Zeus's precision. The pantheon fractured under stress it had never planned for. The warrior did not need to attack Olympus yet. The gods were dismantling themselves. The age when gods walked among mortals was reaching its terminal phase, not through conquest, but exposure. The world had seen divinity fail. It had watched inevitability bend gods instead of the other way around. And in that realization, something irreversible occurred. Mortals stopped asking whether gods could be killed. They began asking what would happen after. This tale belongs to God of War. A world where myth is not distant history, but living weather. In its earliest chapters, the gods are not symbols carved into temple stone. They are present forces with voices, tempers, and hands that can reach down into a city street. In this Greece, people do not merely believe in the divine, they live beneath it. Every mountain has a name that is also a warning. Every sea has moods that feel like someone's breath. When storms arrive, they are not only wind and rain, they are messages. When harvests fail, it is not simply poor soil, it is displeasure. When armies march, they do so knowing that a god may already be walking beside them, unseen, listening for prayers and promises. And that is how the age begins, not with a single war, but with a kind of agreement. Long before Kratos is known, the Olympians shaped the world through a quiet economy of devotion. Worship is not only gratitude, it is a currency. Temples are not merely places of comfort, they are anchoring points, binding a city to a patron. A people's rituals, sacrifices, and oaths become a form of weight in the world, a steady offering that strengthens a god's presence. When a city turns faithless, its patron's influence thins. When devotion burns bright, miracles become easier, and the god's attention comes quicker. Yet the gods do not simply give because they are loved, they give because it suits them. Zeus, high and watchful, rules not only by thunder, but by balance. He understands something mortals rarely do. The greatest threat to a god is not a single hero with a blade, but a world that stops needing gods at all. So Olympus encourages dependence. People pray for rain instead of learning to endure drought. Kings consult oracles instead of trusting their own judgment. Soldiers beg for strength rather than refusing a needless war. This is not kindness, it is strategy wrapped in gold and incense. And beneath that strategy lies an older truth, one written into the bones of the world. Before Olympians wore crowns, the world belonged to deeper powers, titans, ancient and vast, who did not merely rule nature, but were nature in its cruelest forms. In this universe, divinity is not only a title, it is a type of being, shaped by origin. The titans are primal, like continental plates grinding in the dark. The Olympians are newer, sharper, more human in their passions. Their victory was not simply a battle, it was a change in the world's language. After the titans fell, reality became more responsive to names, symbols, and chosen roles. A god of war did not just embody battle, he could steer it. A god of the sea could demand an offering and answer with waves. But the old powers did not vanish cleanly.
They sank, and where they sank, the world became thin. There are places in Greece, certain caverns, certain ruins, certain cliff faces that seem too old for the rock they're carved into, where the boundary between mortal ground and divine structure feels weak. In those places, magic is not learned like a craft, it is caught like a fever. A desperate prayer might become a curse. A grieving song might call something up from below. People tell each other these are haunted places, but the truth is more precise. They are places where the world still remembers what it was before Olympus polished it into order. This is why oracles matter. Not because they are always right, but because prophecy in this world is a mechanism, not a metaphor. The future is not a straight road, it is a sea of possible outcomes stirred by divine will and mortal choice. The oracles are not simply fortune tellers, they are listeners to the deeper currents. They enter trances, and in those trances they glimpse patterns, a line of blood that leads to a throne, a shadow that falls over a city, a child who will one day ruin everything. The gods fear prophecy for a very intimate reason. Prophecy is one of the few forces that can corner them. A god can change a battlefield, a god can curse a king, but when a prophecy locks into place, when enough threads converge around one future, even Zeus must treat it like a blade held close to his throat. And so the gods do what powerful beings always do when faced with something they cannot fully control. They try to control the people who can hear it. Temples protect certain seers. Kings imprison others. Some oracles are revered, dressed in silk, fed sweet fruits, surrounded by incense and music, not to honor them, but to keep them close, monitored, predictable. Other prophets disappear quietly because what they know makes them dangerous. This is the atmosphere of the age, a civilization built under divine attention and a divine court forever anxious that its own foundations might crack. And the cracks do appear. They appear in the way gods treat their roles like masks they can adjust. Ares, the god of war, is worshipped for victory, but he is not satisfied with victory alone. He wants conflict that never ends, because endless war makes him endlessly necessary. Athena values strategy and justice, but her justice is often indistinguishable from Olympus preserving its preferred order. Poseidon takes offense like a storm takes offense, sudden, personal, disproportionate. Even Hermes, swift and bright, carries secrets that can cut deeper than blades. The gods are close enough to mortals that their flaws drip directly into human life, and so mortal ambition begins to twist. In cities that praise Ares, generals become addicted to conquest. In places devoted to Athena, rulers justify cruelty as wisdom. In coastal kingdoms devoted to Poseidon, fishermen throw their best catch back into the sea, hoping to buy calmer waters with hunger. Worship shapes culture, and culture shapes history. Yet there is one more rule that governs this world, quieter than prophecy and older than temples. Power can be taken, not easily, not without consequence, but it can be stolen, traded, and devoured. Gods draw strength from worship, yes, but also from fear, from oaths, from spilled blood offered with meaning. The more a god's domain dominates mortal life, the more that god's presence thickens. This is why Ares loves war. It is why plague can become a kind of altar. It is why the gods sometimes allow tragedies to spread. Suffering can be fuel if it is shaped into the right story. Which brings us, inevitably, to the man who will become the sharpest story of all. Not yet a legend, not yet a warning whispered around fires, just a Spartan, one among many, with ash still in his lungs from 1,000 battles and the discipline of his homeland carved into his bones. Kratos is born into a world that already expects gods to interfere. He grows up hearing that a man can earn divine favor through brutality, that war is not only survival but identity. In Sparta, strength is prayer, endurance is devotion. To hesitate is to insult the order of things. And in time, Kratos becomes what Sparta trains its sons to become, a weapon with a human face. He marries, he has a child, and for a while there is softness in his life, not enough to make him gentle, but enough to make him anchored. That anchor will matter later, because it will be what breaks him. For now, he marches, he fights for Sparta, he leads men who trust him, and he meets battle after battle with the same cold focus. The gods watch such men closely. A warrior with enough violence and enough will is like a spark near dry grass. A god of war does not ignore sparks.
One day, on a battlefield stained dark with old blood, Kratos faces an enemy that should crush him. His men begin to fall. The ground becomes slippery, not with rain, but with the cost of losing. The sky looks too wide, too indifferent, and in that widening moment, when a mortal realizes he cannot win by mortal means, the oldest instinct of this age rises in him like breath.
He calls out, not to the heavens in general, but to a name that answers quickly. Ares hears the plea of a desperate Spartan captain, and the world leans in, listening. Because in this age, when gods still walk among mortals, a single prayer can be the first step toward a fate that devours everything. Ares does not answer prayers with words, he answers with weight. When the Spartan captain cries out, the world does not blaze with light or tremble with thunder. Instead, the air thickens as if something immense has leaned closer. Time does not stop, but it hesitates just long enough for a god to make himself known without appearing at all. This is how divine bargains are sealed in this age. Ares offers victory not as a gift, but as an exchange. Power is never granted freely. It must attach itself to something human. In Kratos' case, it binds to his will. The god does not simply strengthen his arm, he reshapes the rules around him. Enemy blades glance away at the wrong angles. Pain becomes distant, like a sound heard through water. Rage sharpens into clarity. And then the blades of chaos arrive. They are not forged on any anvil mortals would recognize. They are instruments designed to erase the space between a god's desire and a man's action. Chains bite into Kratos' flesh, searing themselves around his forearms, not as restraints, but as conduits. Through them, Ares can reach, not constantly, not fully, but enough. This is the true structure of divine servitude in the world of gods, not possession, but proximity. The blades of chaos do more than kill. They rewrite the story of every battle. When Kratos wields them, violence takes on intention. Enemies do not simply fall, they are offered. Each life taken feeds the domain Ares embodies. Each scream strengthens the god's presence in the world. This is why Ares prefers champions to armies. One man, shaped correctly, can generate more meaningful slaughter than 1,000 soldiers following orders. Kratos wins the battle. He survives where logic says he should die. And in that survival, a new system locks into place. From that moment on, Kratos is no longer merely a Spartan warrior who prays. He is a node in a divine network. His victories ripple upward. His failures are felt. When he fights, Ares watches. When he hesitates, Ares corrects. This is not guidance, it is pressure, subtle and relentless. The Spartans celebrate him. They do not see the chains, they see results. In Sparta, excellence is the highest virtue, and Kratos becomes its living proof. His rise changes how commanders think. Discipline gives way to ambition. Strategy bends toward spectacle. If their greatest warrior draws strength from the god of war, then war itself must be holy. The city's devotion shifts, narrowing, hardening. Offerings to Ares increase. Festivals become more brutal. Children are taught not just to endure pain, but to welcome it. Ares is pleased, yet pleasure is not his goal. What Ares seeks is transformation. He believed that mortals, left to themselves, grow cautious. They build families. They imagine futures that do not involve constant conflict. Ares sees this as decay. His answer is to burn away softness by example. Kratos becomes that example, a man who proves that surrendering to violence brings reward. So Ares pushes him, not all at once, not crudely. Orders arrive through dreams and instincts, a sense that a village is suspect, a whisper that mercy is weakness, a tightening in the chest whenever Kratos considers disobedience. This is another hidden law of godly influence. Gods rarely command directly. They align desire until refusal feels unnatural. Kratos does not question it, not at first. He believes he is choosing. He believes he is protecting Sparta, securing its dominance, ensuring that his wife and daughter live under the shield of a strong city. This belief matters, because belief is what allows the system to function. A champion who understands he is a tool begins to resist. A champion who believes he is righteous becomes unstoppable. Years pass like this. Battles blur together. Names of fallen enemies pile up behind him, indistinct. The blades grow heavier, not in mass, but in memory. They remember every kill, every hesitation overcome. They hum softly when blood is near. Kratos begins to dream less of home and more of fire, and Ares prepares the final shaping. There is a reason gods test their champions with cruelty rather than kindness. Cruelty binds deeper. It scars the mind in ways gratitude never can. Ares does not want a servant who might one day walk away. He wants a creature who cannot imagine being anything else. So he gives Kratos a command designed to sever the last thread. A village devoted not to Ares, but to a gentler god. A place where songs are sung instead of war chants, where children laugh too freely. Ares tells Kratos that the village harbors enemies of Sparta, traitors, threats that must be erased. The Spartan obeys. He always has. In the temple, at the village's heart, blinded by rage and obedience, Kratos slaughters without restraint. The blades sing, the chains pull. The god watches closely, ensuring there is no pause long enough for doubt to form. Only after the blood settles does the truth emerge. Among the dead are his wife and daughter, brought there by Ares' design, placed carefully in the path of Kratos' violence. This is not an accident. It is a lesson. Ares wants Kratos to understand that there is no safe separation between his divine purpose and his mortal life. There is only war, and those who stand too close to it will burn. The ashes of his family cling to his skin, fused by divine curse. They do not wash away. They never will. From that moment on, Kratos' body becomes a living monument to the cost of serving a god. The system completes itself. Grief becomes rage. Rage becomes fuel. Fuel becomes obedience. But Ares miscalculates something essential. He assumes that breaking a man will leave nothing behind but loyalty. What he creates instead is memory. And memory, in a world ruled by prophecy and divine balance, is dangerous. Kratos does not turn on Ares immediately. He does not rebel.
He does not even understand fully what has been done to him. He wanders, hollow, continuing to fight because fighting is all he knows. But something has changed in how the world responds to him. Oracles begin to avoid his gaze. Temples feel colder when he enters. Other gods take notice, because the ashes on Kratos' skin are not merely a curse, they are a mark of interference, proof that a god has pushed too far, too personally, too visibly. The Olympians tolerate cruelty, they do not tolerate imbalance. Ares' act threatens the unspoken agreement that keeps Olympus stable. Gods may use mortals, but they must not erase the boundary entirely. Kratos becomes a problem, not because he is powerful yet, but because he remembers. And in this age, when gods still walk among mortals, a man who remembers what the gods have done to him is the first crack in the world's oldest order. After the ashes settle, the gods grow quiet around Kratos. Not absent, never absent, but distant in a way that feels deliberate. This silence is not mercy, it is calculation. In the years that followed the destruction of his family, Kratos becomes a wanderer of conflict, moving from battlefield to battlefield with no banner and no home. He fights because the world still demands it, because the blades do not release him, and because stopping would mean listening to what remains inside him. Yet something subtle has shifted in how divine forces interact with him.
Where once Ares pressed constantly, now there is restraint. Olympus has noticed the fracture. This is the first time the gods begin to fear consequence rather than opposition. They do not fear Kratos as a warrior, they fear him as evidence. In this age, divine order depends on distance. Gods walk among mortals, yes, but always with enough separation to preserve myth. They may destroy cities, curse bloodlines, flood coastlines, but they must remain symbols as much as actors. Ares broke this rule by making Kratos' suffering unmistakably personal and unmistakably intentional. The ashes on his skin tell a story even a peasant can understand. A god used a man's love as a weapon. Olympus responds the only way it knows how, by hiding knowledge. The oracles who once spoke freely now cloud their visions when Kratos is near. When he seeks answers, he receives fragments instead of truths. Prophecies become riddles stripped of context. This is not coincidence. The gods understand that knowledge, once shared, cannot be retrieved, so they limit the flow. They let Kratos exist, but they starve him of explanation. This reveals another system of the world, divine governance through selective ignorance. Mortals are not kept obedient only through fear or reward. They are kept obedient by never being allowed to see the full shape of cause and effect. The gods allow glimpses, not maps. They permit hope, not clarity. As long as people cannot connect suffering to divine choice with certainty, worship continues. Kratos begins to sense this manipulation instinctively. He notices how priests lower their eyes, how temples feel hollow, as if the statues are listening but unwilling to speak, how his prayers, not for power but for release, go unanswered. The gods who once demanded his devotion now refuse even acknowledgement. This refusal hardens into something new. Hatred alone burns fast and blind.
What grows in Kratos is slower. It is resentment sharpened by understanding. He begins to realize that Ares was not an exception. He was an example taken too far. And Olympus closes ranks. Athena, more cautious than the others, watches Kratos closely. She does not intervene yet, but she understands what Zeus does not fully grasp. The danger is not that Kratos might rebel, but that he might learn. A warrior who understands the structure of divine power is far more threatening than one who simply rages against it.
Meanwhile, Ares remains unrepentant. He sees no error in his actions. From his perspective, Kratos' suffering is proof of success. The Spartan no longer hesitates. He no longer protects softness. He has become pure war, a living extension of Ares' domain. In Ares' mind, the Olympians are cowards for their restraint, afraid of mortals seeing the truth of what gods are willing to do. This difference in philosophy fractures Olympus internally. For the first time since the Titans fell, the gods are divided, not by external threat, but by method. Some believe mortals must be kept close, controlled gently, guided by ritual and myth. Others believe fear and domination are more honest, that mortals should know exactly how small they are. Zeus allows this tension to exist because it serves balance. Conflict among gods prevents any one of them from growing too dominant. As long as Ares and Athena pull in different directions, Olympus remains stable. Zeus tolerates Ares' excesses because war keeps humanity dependent. He tolerates Ares' restraint because order keeps civilization functional. The suffering between these poles is, to him, acceptable. Kratos is not acceptable. He is unpredictable. When Kratos eventually seeks the Oracle of Athens, he does not come as a supplicant, but as a man with nothing left to lose. The Oracle sees what the gods have tried to hide. She sees not only Kratos' past, but his future weight, the way his existence bends probabilities around him. She understands something critical about prophecy that Olympus often forgets. Prophecy does not cause events. It reveals pressure points where choice becomes unbearable. She offers Kratos a bargain, not with power, but with hope. If he serves the gods for 10 more years, she says, his nightmares may end. The visions of blood and fire may fade. His guilt may be eased. This is another mechanism of divine control, atonement through service. The gods do not forgive, they delay. They offer relief just far enough away that obedience becomes the only path forward. Kratos accepts not because he believes them, but because the alternative is endless madness. For a decade, he becomes the gods' problem solver. Monsters that threaten cities, ancient horrors awakened by neglected ruins, remnants of Titan-era abominations that Olympus would rather not acknowledge publicly. Kratos is sent where subtlety is impossible. He destroys what must not be remembered. Each task pushes him further from humanity and deeper into the machinery of divine maintenance. Through this, he learns. He learns that many monsters are not born, but abandoned. Creatures once bound by gods and forgotten when priorities changed. He learns that temples are often built not to honor gods, but to imprison something beneath them. He learns that when cities vanish from history, it is often because Olympus prefers silence to explanation. Most importantly, he learns that the gods are not immortal in the way mortals imagine. They endure, but they are not unchanging. They can weaken,
They can lose relevance, they can be replaced. And somewhere beneath all of this, prophecy stirs again. The whispers the gods tried to bury resurface among the fates, older and colder than Olympus itself. Threads tighten, possibilities narrow. A truth begins to take shape that terrifies even Zeus. A god may fall not to a titan, not to another god, but to a man shaped perfectly by divine cruelty. Kratos completes his final task. The gods keep their promise, but in the way gods always do. His nightmares ease, not because he is forgiven, but because his mind is emptied. The memories do not disappear, they become quieter, packed away where they can no longer scream. And in that quiet, something worse grows: clarity. Kratos no longer begs, he no longer pleads. When he stands before the gods again, he does so not as a servant, but as a witness. He knows now that the world is held together not by justice, but by habit. The gods rule because they always have, and habits can be broken. The age when gods still walked among mortals does not end in fire all at once. It ends the way all long dominations end, when the oppressed learns the rules well enough to use them. Kratos has learned the rules, and Olympus, for the first time since the Titans fell, begins to understand what it has truly created. When clarity settles into Kratos, it does not arrive as peace, it arrives as structure. For the first time, he begins to see the invisible boundaries that shape divine action, limits the gods never speak of, yet never cross. Olympus presents itself as absolute, but its power is governed by laws older than Zeus's throne. These laws are not written, they are enforced by consequence.
Ares, drunk on war and convinced of his own necessity, believes he has outgrown Olympus's restraint. He sees Athens as an insult, a city protected by Athena's wisdom rather than his brutality. Where Sparta glorifies endurance and conquest, Athens values reason, art, and measured strength. Its people pray not for endless battle, but for balance. To Ares, this is weakness masquerading as culture. And so he breaks another unspoken rule. He does not merely guide war, he wages it openly. Ares manifests his will through armies, monsters, and siege engines animated by divine rage. Athens burns not because its walls fail, but because its patron god is forbidden from responding in kind. This reveals one of the most critical systems of the world: divine non-intervention laws among equals. The Olympians may act through champions, omens, and disasters, but direct war between gods risks unraveling the world's structure. When gods fight openly, reality bends too violently. The Titanomachy nearly shattered existence itself. Zeus remembers this. He enforces restraint not out of mercy, but survival. Athena understands this law better than any other god. She cannot confront Ares directly. Doing so would justify escalation. It would invite Zeus's judgment. It could fracture Olympus beyond repair. Instead, she must act indirectly, through a mortal who exists just close enough to divinity to matter, yet distant enough to avoid cosmic collapse.
she chooses Kratos. This choice is not compassion, it is precision. Athena approaches Kratos not as a ruler, but as a strategist. She does not command, she explains just enough. She tells him that Ares threatens the balance of Olympus. She tells him that if Ares succeeds, war will become the world's defining constant. She tells him that the gods cannot stop him, but he might. Kratos listens, not because he trusts her, but because this aligns with what he has already learned. Athena reveals the existence of a weapon the gods themselves fear, the Box of Pandora. It is not merely an artifact, it is a containment system designed during the Titan War, meant to store powers too volatile to leave loose in the world. When the Titans were defeated, some of their essence, rage, domination, endless hunger, could not be destroyed. The box was created to lock these forces away, hidden where even gods hesitated to look. Here, another system becomes clear: power inheritance through containment. Divine power is not infinite. It is accumulated, transferred, and sometimes imprisoned. The box does not create strength. It releases what was already stolen from defeated gods.
To open it is to become a vessel for something ancient and ruinous. Athena tells Kratos that only by opening the box can he gain the strength to kill a god. This is not a metaphor. Gods can die. They do not perish like mortals. Their deaths tear domains apart. When a god falls, the concept they governed destabilizes. Killing Ares would not end war, but it would remove its loudest voice, its most reckless architect. Kratos accepts the task without reverence. He journeys to the Temple of Pandora, a structure built not to protect the box, but to test those who seek it. The temple is alive with mechanisms designed by gods who understood that brute strength alone should never be enough. It demands patience, sacrifice, and the willingness to endure loss without reward. This journey teaches Kratos something crucial. The gods do not trust even themselves. Every trap, every puzzle, every cruelty embedded in the temple reflects divine paranoia. The Olympians feared that one day one of their own might seek the box, so they designed obstacles that punish impatience and arrogance, traits the gods themselves possess in abundance. Kratos survives not because he is chosen, but because he adapts. When he finally opens the box, the power released does not feel like rage. It feels like expansion. His perception stretches beyond mortal limits. He does not simply become stronger, he becomes heavier in the world, more difficult to ignore. This is what terrifies Olympus. A mortal carrying Titan-forged power disrupts every hierarchy they depend on. Ares responds with fury. He does not retreat, he does not negotiate. He brings the war directly to Kratos, believing raw dominance will prevail. Their battle is not just physical, it is symbolic. A god confronting the consequences of his own methods. When Kratos kills Ares, the world reacts. War does not end, but it changes tone. Battles become smaller, more human. The constant divine pressure lifts slightly. Olympus feels the shock like a fault line slipping. A god has been slain by a man. Zeus hides his fear behind ceremony. Athena presents Kratos with a reward meant to close the wound quietly. She offers him godhood,
not as absolution, but as containment. By raising Kratos to Olympus, the gods hope to neutralize him, bind him to their system, and prevent others from following his path. Kratos accepts, not because he desires divinity, but because he understands leverage. He ascends as the new god of war, taking Ares' place. The irony does not escape him. He now sits among the very beings he despises, watching them maneuver, excuse cruelty, and rewrite history. Olympus pretends that Ares' fall was an anomaly, a correction rather than a warning. But the warning has already been delivered. The age when gods still walk among mortals does not collapse immediately after Ares' death. It fractures slowly, invisibly. Mortals begin to whisper. Heroes begin to wonder. The idea that gods are untouchable fades into something softer, more dangerous: doubt. And Kratos, now seated among the divine, learns the final truth of Olympus. The gods did not create the world, they inherited it. An inheritance, once proven transferable, is never secure again. Kratos does not feel divine when he takes his place on Olympus. There is no revelation, no harmony, no sudden understanding of the cosmos. Godhood arrives as weight, a constant pressure behind the eyes, a sensation of being tethered to everything war touches. Where once he felt rage as a tool, now he feels it as a current flowing through the world, tugging at him from every battlefield, every raised blade, every trembling city preparing for violence. This is how divine domains truly function. A god does not command their sphere, they are bound to it. As the new god of war, Kratos inherits not only Ares' title, but the accumulated echoes of every conflict ever dedicated to that role. Ancient grudges, oaths sworn on blood-soaked soil, wars begun for reasons long forgotten. These memories do not speak in words, they manifest as pressure, urging action, demanding relevance. War, left unattended, seeks expression. This is the trap of Olympus. Gods appear sovereign, but their identities are prisons shaped like crowns. Kratos quickly realizes that Ares was not uniquely cruel. He was overexposed. He let the demands of his domain consume his judgment. Now, Kratos feels the same pull, but resists instinctively. He refuses to encourage pointless slaughter. He does not whisper into generals' dreams. He does not demand offerings. This resistance has consequences. Cities that once relied on divine war favor feel abandoned. Victories become harder, losses more costly. Mortals begin to question why the new god of war does not act like the old one. In temples, priests argue quietly. In battlefields, commanders curse a god who does not answer prayers, and Olympus notices.
The gods understand something Kratos is still learning, a domain that weakens its god. Worship is not optional fuel, it is structural reinforcement. When belief erodes, so does presence. If Kratos allows war to lose its divine urgency, his position becomes unstable. Zeus watches this with narrowing patience. From his throne, Zeus sees Olympus not as a family, but as an engine. Each god is a component, performing a necessary function to keep the world predictable. Storms remind mortals of fear. Seas remind them of humility. War reminds them of dependence. A god who refuses to perform destabilizes the entire mechanism. Zeus does not confront Kratos directly.
That would imply equality. Instead, he reshapes the environment around him. This introduces another system of divine control: narrative authority. History in this world is not written by mortals alone. The gods influence which stories survive, which songs spread, which heroes are remembered. Zeus allows bards to sing of Ares' ferocity as necessary, as glorious. He encourages myths where restraint is portrayed as weakness. Slowly, subtly, the image of the god of war begins to fracture, not because of what Kratos does, but because of how others speak about him. Kratos feels this erosion. He senses his connection to war thinning in places where it once burned hot. His power does not vanish, but it grows uneven. In some regions he is revered, in others ignored. Olympus thrives on this imbalance. A divided god is easier to manage. Athena attempts to mediate. She advises Kratos to adapt, to shape war more intelligently rather than rejecting it. She argues that restraint does not require absence, that influence can be exercised quietly. But Kratos hears in her counsel the same logic that justified every cruelty before. Control it better, and it will be acceptable. He refuses. This refusal marks a turning point. For the first time, a god actively resists the purpose assigned to him. This resistance sends ripples through the deeper architecture of reality. Domains are meant to be stable. A god questioning their function introduces friction where none should exist. The Sisters of Fate feel it. Older than Olympus, the Fates do not rule events, but probability. They maintain the loom of causality, ensuring that outcomes follow patterns stable enough to prevent collapse. When Kratos disrupts the expected behavior of the god of war, threads begin to tangle. Futures multiply, certainties thin. The Fates respond the way they always do when instability appears, by correction. They examine Kratos not as a person, but as a variable. In countless possible futures, they see the same divergence. Kratos does not merely disobey Olympus, he survives it. Again and again, their loom shows a man-god who does not conform, whose existence weakens the authority of inherited power. This is unacceptable. Zeus, informed by the Fates' unease, makes his decision. Kratos must be removed, not publicly, not violently, not yet. The gods understand that killing Kratos outright would confirm everything mortals have begun to suspect, that Olympus fears its own creations. Instead, Zeus plans something more elegant: isolation, exhaustion, eventual erasure through inevitability. He waits, and in waiting, he allows tragedy to return to the world. Without a god of war who actively stokes conflict, human disputes do not vanish. They become chaotic, unstructured, unpredictable. Wars break out without divine choreography. Victories do not align with ritual. Cities fall that were never meant to. This chaos gives Zeus the justification he needs. He presents Kratos as the cause. To the gods, he argues that neglect has consequences. To mortals, the absence of clear divine favor feels like abandonment. Zeus positions himself as the necessary hand that must restore order, even if that means disciplining one of their own. Kratos senses the shift too late. When Zeus finally acts, he does so not as a father or king, but as executioner cloaked in ceremony.
He confronts Kratos under the guise of correction, accusing him of arrogance, of misusing his divine role. He strips Kratos of much of his godly power, forcing it back into mortal limits, and casts him down. This act reveals the final, most dangerous system of Olympus. Godhood can be revoked. Not cleanly, not without damage, but Zeus proves that divinity is not a birthright, it is a status maintained through compliance. A god who refuses to serve the structure can be reduced, rewritten, or destroyed. Kratos survives the fall. He always survives, but survival is no longer enough. Stripped of his place, hunted by former peers, and betrayed by the system he momentarily joined, Kratos understands the truth Olympus hoped to hide forever. The gods are not eternal rulers, safeguarding reality.
They are caretakers who refuse to step aside. And as long as they cling to borrowed thrones, the world will remain trapped in cycles of suffering designed to justify their existence. Kratos rises again, not as a Spartan, not as a god of war, but as something far more dangerous. A being who has seen Olympus from the inside, and who knows now that the age when gods still walk among mortals will not end through rebellion alone, but through dismantling the very idea that gods are necessary at all. When Zeus casts Kratos down, the world does not correct itself, it destabilizes. This is the flaw Olympus never admits. Divine order only appears stable when every piece submits. The moment resistance survives, the system reveals its brittleness. Kratos' fall does not restore balance, it introduces asymmetry. A former god who remembers godhood, and a ruling pantheon now exposed as conditional. Kratos awakens in the mortal world, diminished but not emptied. The power stripped from him leaves scars in reality, not clean absences. His strength is reduced, yet something else sharpens in its place: awareness. He senses how divine influence flows now, not as commands from above, but as pressures that slide along the edges of choice. He can feel where Zeus nudges a king toward cruelty, where Poseidon tightens a current to punish defiance, where Athena bends a strategy until it looks like wisdom. This sensitivity is not a gift, it is residue. Godhood leaves traces, and those traces allow Kratos to see the seams. The fates respond quickly. They do not announce themselves. They never do. Their presence manifests as narrowing outcomes. Paths that once led forward end abruptly. Allies arrive too late. Storms gather at inconvenient moments. Probability begins to lean against him. This is how the loom enforces obedience without spectacle. Yet Kratos does not collapse under it. He adapts. Years of survival under divine pressure have taught him something the fates underestimate. Causality can be resisted locally, even when the grand pattern is hostile. A single decision made at the right moment can bend a thread without snapping it. Kratos begins to choose against expectation, not randomly, but deliberately, testing the loom's tolerance. He seeks the sisters not for mercy, but for confrontation. This decision marks a new phase in the world's history. No mortal has ever pursued the fates directly, with intent to challenge their authority. Heroes stumble into prophecy. Kings are trapped by it. But Kratos understands now that prophecy is not destiny. It is a pressure forecast, and forecasts can be disrupted.
The journey to the Temple of the Fates reveals another hidden structure of reality. Time in this world is layered, not linear. The temple exists simultaneously in several moments. Doors open into past failures and future regrets. Mechanisms respond not to strength, but to remembrance. To move forward, Kratos must confront versions of himself shaped by different choices. The man who served Ares without doubt, the god who refused his domain, the warrior who accepted Olympus's crown believing leverage would be enough. Each version fails, and each failure teaches him what the fates already know. Power is not what breaks destiny. Continuity is. The sisters control outcomes by maintaining uninterrupted narrative flow. Events must follow one another in ways that feel inevitable. The moment inevitability is questioned, not emotionally but structurally, their control weakens. Kratos does not ask them to change his fate. He kills them. This act does not erase destiny, it fractures it. Without the fates to maintain coherence, time does not unravel, it becomes contestable. The past can be revisited, certain outcomes can be rejected. This terrifies Olympus more than any blade ever could. Zeus understands at once that the old safeguards are gone. The world can no longer be steered solely through prediction and restraint. War between gods becomes unavoidable. Yet even now, the Olympians hesitate. They fear not Kratos' strength, which remains limited, but his method. He does not storm Olympus blindly. He moves with purpose, dismantling support systems rather than confronting symbols. He targets messengers, severs lines of influence, collapses the myths that sustain divine authority. This reveals the final architecture of godly power. Belief precedes dominance. When Hermes falls, speed does not vanish from the world, but the flow of information collapses. Messages are delayed, alliances misalign. When Helios is destroyed, the sun still rises, but it no longer obeys Olympus's schedule. Days lengthen unpredictably. Crops fail in regions once carefully managed by ritual calendars. Each god's death removes a layer of mediation between mortals and reality. The world grows harsher, but more honest. Zeus responds with escalation. He abandons subtlety and embraces raw force, calling down storms not as warnings, but as punishments.
Mountains split, seas swallow cities. This is the risk Zeus always feared. Open divine war damages the very world gods claim to rule. But he sees no alternative. To allow Kratos to continue is to accept the end of Olympus as an institution. Athena's role shifts. She no longer attempts to guide Kratos. She observes, she records. Athena understands that this conflict will redefine divinity itself. If Kratos succeeds, the age of gods as rulers will end. What replaces it is unknown, and Athena has always valued knowledge over comfort. The final confrontations approach not as destiny fulfilled, but as structure dismantled piece by piece. Kratos confronts Zeus not merely as an enemy, but as a system incarnate. Their struggle is not just physical, it is ideological.
Zeus fights to preserve hierarchy. Kratos fights to end necessity. Zeus insists the world requires gods to function. Kratos proves, through devastation and survival alike, that the world persists even when divine order collapses. When Zeus falls, something unprecedented happens. Nothing claims his throne. Lightning still strikes, storms still gather. Authority does not. Olympus stands empty, not ruined beyond repair, but irrelevant. The gods who remain withdraw, scattered, diminished, stripped of narrative centrality. Mortals do not rejoice, they endure. The world enters a quieter, more uncertain age, and Kratos, having torn down the structure that defined him, does not rule what remains. He leaves. This is the final lesson of the age when gods still walked among mortals. Divine power was never the problem, dependency was. With Olympus broken, the world begins learning, painfully, unevenly, how to exist without constant divine supervision. Myths fade into memory. Worship transforms into story. Fear loosens its grip. The gods no longer walk openly among mortals, not because they are all dead, but because the world no longer bends itself to make room for them. And somewhere beyond the ruins of Greece, Kratos walks into a future shaped not by prophecy, but by consequence, carrying the weight of an age ended not by forgetting the gods, but by understanding them completely. In the world of God of War, there was a time before legends became bedtime stories, and before people learned to say the names of gods with careful mouths. Back then, the gods did not feel distant. They did not belong to paintings, temples, or the edge of prayer. They belonged to the road, to the sea, to the mountain pass, where the air turned thin and the wind carried the taste of iron. In that age, a traveler might wake at dawn to find a shadow standing over the campfire, too large to be human, too calm to be a beast, and realize with a slow tightening in the ribs that a god had simply decided to pass by.
This is not a world where divinity lives behind glass. It is a world where divinity walks barefoot through your village and leaves footprints you cannot pretend you did not see. And the first thing to understand, gently but clearly, is this. In God of War, the gods are not only worshipped, they rule. Not as distant creators, but as powerful beings with territory, lineage, pride, and appetite. Their presence is political as much as it is sacred. A temple is not only a place of reverence, it is also a border marker, a warning, a promise that someone above you is watching, and they can be generous or cruel depending on what kind of day they are having. In the earliest remembered age, when the old myths still breathed like living animals, mortals learned the first law of survival. Do not treat a god like an idea. Treat them like a neighbor who owns the only well for miles. Because the gods did not simply grant blessings, they controlled systems, and those systems were woven into ordinary life so tightly that you could not separate the divine from the practical. There were harvests that depended on sacred rites, yes, but also on agreements, spoken or unspoken, between rival powers in the heavens. There were safe roads, and roads that were safe only because a particular deity had claimed them as a personal route, and no lesser creature dared to hunt there.
There were towns that prospered not because they were clever, but because they sat beneath the gaze of a patron who wanted applause. Yet even this, even the daily closeness had its rules. The gods in their own way were bound, not by morality and not by kindness, but by order, a kind of divine physics. And that order had a heart. The realms themselves were structured like a living map, held together by ancient forces older than any single pantheon's pride. Mortals often thought the world belonged to one set of gods at a time, as if the sky were a crown passed from head to head. But the truth is stranger and quieter. The world in God of War is layered with realms, paths, and ancient boundaries that do not vanish simply because new gods rise to power. When one divine age dominates a region, it does not erase what came before. It builds on top of it, like a city built on ruins, then built again. And if you know where to dig, if you can survive long enough to learn, the old stones still speak. This is why the past in this world never truly dies. It sleeps, and sometimes it wakes, angry and hungry when the wrong footstep disturbs it. In the time when gods still walked among mortals, people became experts in reading signs, not because they were wise, but because they were afraid. A sudden flock of birds turning at the same moment could mean a divine presence crossing the valley.
A river that ran warm in winter might mean someone powerful had touched the water. And when the signs came, the villages responded the way a shoreline responds to a storm. They prepared offerings, they hid their children, they straightened their backs and tried to look grateful, because gratitude in that age was often a form of armor. And still, mortals did not live only in fear. They lived in bargains. Here is one of the first systems you must understand about this world. Worship is a currency, not metaphorically, not poetically, in practice. The gods draw strength not merely from belief, but from recognition, from ritual attention, from the shaping of the mortal world around their names. A god whose temples are busy is a god whose influence is tangible. A god whose name is spoken with love or dread becomes more present, more capable of bending events without having to lift a hand. This is why gods compete, not only for territory, but for story, for songs, for a place in the minds of those who will never meet them, yet still feed them with memory. But there is a second layer, and it is colder, because gods do not only harvest worship, they harvest fate. In the Greek era, when Olympus sat like a bright wound in the sky, mortals learned that destiny itself could be treated as material. A prophecy was not just a prediction, it was a force, a pressure in reality, something that could pull people toward ruin like a current. And prophecy made the gods nervous, because prophecy did not always belong to them. It belonged to older powers. The Morai, the Fates, wove threads that even gods hesitated to touch. In that era, kings did not merely consult priests, they consulted anyone who claimed to have heard the whisper of the loom. A single line of prophecy could start wars, because everyone understood the same terrifying truth. If fate has chosen a path, fighting it might only make it sharper. So the clever tried to reinterpret fate, to bend meaning instead of breaking destiny. And this created a culture of careful language, coded rituals, and ruthless politics.
A god might bless a hero not because they loved them, but because the hero was a useful wedge against prophecy's pressure. A god might sponsor a city not out of kindness, but because the city sat on the route where a foretold disaster was said to arrive.
This is how divine influence worked in public, not as random miracles, but as constant interference in systems, worship, prophecy, and political balance. And then there is the third layer, the layer that mortals rarely understood until it was too late. Divine power in this world is inherited like a sickness and a crown at the same time. A god is not simply strong. A god is strong because they belong to a line, a family, a history of violence and entitlement. In the Greek world, the Olympians were not a peaceful council. They were a dynasty built on overthrow, titans replaced by gods, old rulers chained, new rulers crowned. Every generation taught the next a lesson written in blood. If you do not secure your throne, someone will take it. And because of that, gods did not only fear enemies, they feared children. They feared anyone who carried their blood, but not their loyalty. This is why divine households became their own empires, and why family dinner could feel like a battlefield with wine cups. To mortals, this translated into an unstable world, because when gods feud, the earth feels it. Storms do not wait politely at sea, they march inland. Plagues do not politely knock, they arrive with a god's wounded pride. And on the roads between cities, travelers would sometimes find the evidence of arguments that had nothing to do with them. A forest burned in a perfect circle, a canyon split like bread, a statue weeping salt water for weeks. In this world, reality carries the fingerprints of divine emotion. That is the quiet horror of living under gods who walk. They do not need to hate you to destroy your life. They only need to be careless with their anger. Yet there were still heroes, not because the world was kind, but because mortals, being small, learned to become sharp. Some heroes were champions of cities. Some were chosen by gods, dressed in favor like armor. And some, most dangerously, were shaped by betrayal, because betrayal is the one thing that can make even an ordinary life become myth. In the earliest shadows of our story, whispers begin of a warrior whose path does not fit neatly into the old structure. Not yet the name people will later fear, not yet the figure carved into warning, but a presence somewhere beyond the polite myths, moving through a world that expects mortals to bow, a world that expects the gods to remain unquestioned. And that is where this age begins to crack, because the closer gods are to mortals, the easier it becomes for mortals to see something uncomfortable. Gods bleed.
Gods lie. Gods panic when prophecy tightens around them. And when a mortal finally understands that, truly understands it, the entire order of the world becomes fragile. In Part 2, we will step into the human landscape beneath Olympus, into the culture that forms around divine proximity, and we will watch the first great mechanism of the age take shape. How mortals were trained from childhood to serve the gods' wars without realizing they were being used, and how one man's life, set in motion by devotion and manipulation, becomes the kind of story that gods themselves begin to fear.
When people speak of the age when gods still walked among mortals, they often imagine thunder and spectacle. But life beneath Olympus was quieter than legend suggests, more organized, more disciplined, and far more intentional. Mortals were not simply living under the gods, they were being shaped by them. From the moment a child could understand instruction, the world began to teach them where they stood in the divine order. Cities were designed not only for defense or trade, but for visibility. Streets curved toward temples. Public squares were aligned so statues caught the sun at specific hours. Even daily routines bent subtly toward worship, not through force, but through habit. In this world, faith was not a leap, it was infrastructure. The gods understood something fundamental about mortals. People obey most willingly when obedience feels like tradition rather than command. So, divine influence embedded itself into culture long before it ever needed to appear as punishment. This is the first system that ruled mortal life beneath Olympus, the system of favor. Every city, every army, every family of note existed within a web of divine approval. Favor was not abstract. It had symptoms. Crops grew evenly. Children survived illness. Ships returned on time. When favor waned, the opposite followed, and everyone noticed. But favor was never permanent. It had to be maintained. Priests did not simply lead prayers, they acted as accountants of the divine. They recorded offerings, tracked rituals, interpreted signs, and, most importantly, decided when a city had failed to please its patron. Their power came not from magic, but from interpretation, and interpretation in a world ruled by gods could decide life or death.